my name's Niki. This is The Interventionalist, and today I want to talk about U-hauling in the lesbian community, but particularly the historical side of U-hauling, or I guess like the historical context of it, because I've been doing a lot of reading about lesbian history, and through that, I've read a lot about the different things that contributed to the pacing in lesbian relationships and the differ in pacing in lesbian relationships compared to straight relationships and the reasons for that, especially historically. And I thought it was super interesting because obviously U-hauling, if you don't know what that is, it essentially just refers to the idea that lesbians move really quickly or they commit really quickly. The joke is like after the first date, they're getting a U-haul to move in together. And it is a stereotype, but if you are in the sapphic world, you also know like there's definitely truth to it, like undeniably. And I feel like there's so many different things that contribute to that that I've talked about in other videos. But in this one, I just kind of want to focus on like the historical context, even sort of like the more like political and social context. And I've been thinking about this, or like the reason it even came to mind, like to think about the historical aspect, is because I've been reading a bunch of different like lesbian history books, and in two of them it like outright mentions the way that lesbian relationships do differ in pace to heterosexual relationships, and the reasons for that. And they both kind of state the same reason, which I thought was really interesting. And the first book I read it in is Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold, which is the history of a lesbian community. And then the second one is Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers, a history of lesbian life in 20th century. And in Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold, it talks about timing of lesbian relationships, and sort of like the landmarks in lesbian relationships or the lack thereof based on sort of social standards and scripts and expectations related to romance and romantic relationships. And in this book, this is what it says about it. I should clarify that the part that I'm about to read is talking about essentially how we determine the seriousness of a relationship or the depth of a relationship, and the way that we measure that, like the depth of a relationship. And often we measure it by the length of time that we're in a relationship. And this is what it says about that. We have come to understand, however, that this judgment derives from a heterosexual model, which assumes that we will all have one serious relationship, marriage, in a lifetime, or if we are less lucky, two. Such an approach does not take into account that some lesbians tend to have longer relationships and others shorter, yet both groups tend to judge their relationships as equally important. Nor does this view validate young lesbians' relatively brief relationships, which in the heterosexual world of the 1940s and 50s would have been preparatory to marriage, but in the lesbian world were not. Time is a subjective and relative phenomenon. I said to Sunny, my girlfriend, one time, I went with her, a previous lover, a long time. She said, how long? 3 months. Because when you're 20, 3 months is a long time. The quality of feeling, its depth, its intensity was as important as time in a person's judgment of the significance of a relationship. Commitment was also essential in determining its seriousness. This variation in the longevity of lesbian relationships has led us to designate the important relationships in people's lives as committed rather than long-term. And when I first read that, because this was the first thing that I read that like spurred this thought for me, immediately like I'm just thinking about the way that particularly historically before marriage was an option for lesbians, or even like social openness regarding relationships was an option, where like you kind of are expected to adhere to sort of social romantic scripts because people are seeing your relationship and it's visible. And then there's like social like appropriateness and standards and expectations that can affect you negatively if you're not fulfilling them when people can see your relationship, right? But these relationships are hidden, so people aren't even seeing your relationship, which I think lessens the way that you have to adhere to these expectations for your own like sort of protection of your social standing. But there was no option for marriage at this time. And there's still places, right, where there isn't an option for same-sex marriage. And I'm in the United States, so it is. But when there isn't an option for marriage, and when your relationship isn't being judged on its ability to reach that checkpoint or that like landmark, and that also is determined by the length of time that you're with someone, because then if you're married, like the idea is that you are in a relationship for the rest of your life. If your relationship is not being judged on the length of time that you're in it or reaching a landmark like marriage, and you don't have that goal to even aim to achieve when you're in a romantic relationship, then how do you determine the seriousness? Because if you're like going up a ladder or levels to determine the seriousness of your relationship in a heteronormative model, it's then probably like dating, certain forms of intimacy and engagement, marriage, and then whatever follows after that. But you have these like landmarks, these checkpoints, and then it'll determine also how meaningful a relationship is. It's supposed to like represent the depth of a relationship. But these are just markers. Like they don't actually represent something, I would say, because you can get married to someone and not know them that well, right? Like that's not an actual requirement to get married, right? But that's sort of the idea. And so it's supposed to be the representation of depth and longevity of your relationship and the seriousness of it, and the level of commitment. And it's like you reach a higher relationship level than anyone who doesn't have that. So you aim for these things and it gives you a timeline to follow. And it's interesting because like lesbians didn't have that option. So you don't have a timeline expectation. You don't have like a script to follow in terms of determining essentially based on these like social and cultural markers, the depth or seriousness of your relationship, which these are supposed to technically represent. I would say that even like affects the pace that you go at a relationship, particularly because when you have these like social scripts and social expectations, it does theoretically create these barriers in the pace of the relationship, right? Like you have these scripted expectations, which is like you go on a date and then after like a few dates, whatever, you kiss. And then after like a certain amount of time, you are physically intimate. And then you meet each other's families or whatever the social script is at the time or in the culture or at the place. That's so dependent, right? Culturally and socially, but you have these scripts that you're supposed to adhere to. And so it naturally places in these barriers related to pacing, but with the pacing eventually leading to the ultimate level of commitment and seriousness, which would be like engagement and marriage. But there's like a natural barrier in place in these like heteronormative models because of like heteronormative relationship expectations. And the way that a lot of your sometimes like social value or worth or capital is judged on your ability to appropriately adhere to these and publicly, visibly, these relationship expectations. But like as lesbians, if marriage isn't even an option and you don't have any like landmarks to determine like, okay, now we're this committed, now it means this much, now we're this serious, because there's nothing to judge. Like there's nothing telling you that this is when you should hit this landmark or this is like this landmark determines how serious your relationship is. I feel like you have sort of like free range to develop your relationship and the depth of it, kind of like it says, like time is subjective and a relative phenomenon. There is no particular timing where a relationship like is supposed to increase in depth at like a certain like marker in time or like within a certain, I don't know, relationship landmark. So you kind of just have like free range, like uncharted territory with no expectation to dive into intimacy and attachment. And I feel like it creates a more open, I don't know if I would say open-minded, but I feel like there's less barriers because of social expectations and also like specific landmarks. Like it just kind of is. Like you just get attached and you just become intimate and you just develop a relationship and there's nothing telling you how or when the relationship should develop and what that means for the relationship, the seriousness of it. So it's like there is no markers. And because of that, I feel like you can go all in and then from there, it just is, you know, like you're not marking the depth or seriousness by these landmarks. So it just is serious and it's just meaningful no matter what. And it's just commitment. Commitment is commitment. And that is just depth. And it's not determined then by more time and a landmark because you're not reaching that landmark, right? There is no landmark to reach and you don't have the social expectations that theoretically you're held to because of social visibility, right? And so like you just get to exist in it. And I think that's why it says like the variation in the longevity of a lesbian relationship has led us to designate the important relationships in people's lives as committed rather than long-term. Because it doesn't matter. There is no like long-term essentially goal that's gonna like make it suddenly a really deep, meaningful, perfected relationship. Like it just already is. It's getting as serious as it can get by being committed because that's essentially kind of the most serious that you can get in a relationship for lesbians is committed. That's it. And I feel like that's the difference. Like the concept of being committed is the equivalent of all of these relationship landmarks because that is the one landmark that I feel like you enter into that differentiates your relationship from something like, I guess, less, I wouldn't say meaningful, but less deep or like less serious. That is the one level, really. And then it also talks about in the other book, it particularly mentions how sex then is like also particularly a marker that is like maybe one of the only other markers that tells you the relationship level and depth. And now it's like, okay, we're committed and we have sexual relations, assuming that that's like a part of your relationship, right? And it's like, okay, then we're basically married. Like, there's nothing else for us to like have these specific relationship landmarks. And let me read the quote from the other book. Okay, this is what this book says, and this is The Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers. It's a little bit long. I know the quotes that I'm reading right now are a little bit long, but they'll get shorter throughout. Okay, this is what it says. Their success was limited primarily because lesbians are raised like other women in this culture. They are taught that what is most crucial about sexuality is that it leads to settling down in marriage. Not having the official heterosexual landmarks of engagement and wedding, lesbians create their own, often telescoping those events in time toward the goal of establishing a home. Joan Lillian, a lesbian sexologist, jokes, the lesbian date is like an engagement, and once you have sex with her, you get married. That's the point like that I just made about how that's probably one of the only other landmarks other than like saying that you're in a committed relationship is sex, if you're in a relationship that had sex. And then it goes on to mention the way that lesbian culture heavily favored or like really heavily pushed or had like a core theme within it of serial monogamy, which is really interesting. And like all of the lesbian history books I've been reading talked about it. The Boots of Leather one also talks about it. Like serial monogamy was a staple of lesbian relationships or lesbian culture, which I think is really interesting. And in this one, it says like bringing up serial monogamy, it says, most lesbians continue to idealize monogamy, although a pattern tended to be serial monogamy, that is, relationships last for a few years, break up, and both women get involved in a new monogamous relationship. I feel like there's less expectation to be in a lifelong relationship as lesbians because you're not held to the lifelong commitments of marriage. Whether or not that, I don't know what that means. Like in my head, I'm thinking like, okay, so if marriage didn't exist and we weren't held to like the lifelong standard once you were married, how many relationships would not be lifelong? In terms of monogamy, would we have more like theoretically short-term monogamous relationships? Or like if lesbians had the opportunity to get married, would they? And then would they prefer to have like a lifelong monogamous relationship? I don't know. That's like a question of marriage and monogamy. And I guess the reality of lifelong relationships, should marriage not exist, I guess, related to monogamy. I guess that's not relevant what I'm talking about. But I think that's really interesting, like the idea that the lesbian date is like an engagement and once you have sex with her, you get married. I just find that so interesting because like, so like the lesbian date is like the engagement and then sex is marriage. Maybe like in my head, I'm thinking lesbian commitment is like the dating and then you have sex and maybe that's marriage. I don't know. One of those is a landmark. Like we really don't have, well, I'm talking like in the history, also depending where you are now. There's no landmarks. Like there's no landmarks, so it just is. And I also think that like allows intimacy to develop at a more natural and free-flowing pace and the depth of it to develop more naturally and quickly for so many different reasons. And for better or for worse, I think that allows lesbians or has allowed them to develop really intense relationships really quickly, particularly because there wasn't these like barriers of pacing or these barriers as a result of social expectation that sort of hindered the pacing of a relationship or kept it going at a certain pace, right? Like the courting pace back in these times, you would call it like someone being courted. The pacing is like clearly laid out. And if you want to maintain your social capital, you should follow the pacing, right? But that book also mentions the concept of the goal then being a home, like the thing that lesbians aim for, like the ultimate, I think, sort of commitment or what they're kind of aiming for, where straight people are aiming for marriage and then I guess like developing a home together, but is building a home, which I found to be really interesting. And I also think a contributor to why lesbians became really codependent. So like, I guess to sum up, when I'm talking about like the lack of sort of pacing inhibitors that could lead to like quicker intimacy and depth of intimacy, I guess the point that when I'm reading this, I think of is that there is no pace really set. You can set things at your own pace. And because of that, you can get attached a lot quicker and things can get more intense quicker. And there's a lot of reasons why I think that intensity developed, particularly like codependence and things like serial monogamy, which I'll like get into more. But I do want to touch on the concept of a home, like establishing a home being really important, because both the books that I just referenced talk about that. And in Boots of Leather, it talks about how it mentioned something that I found to be really important to know, is that for a lot of lesbians, or for some lesbians, they don't have a home, or like they don't have connections to their own homes, or like in their actual life outside of their original homes or families, or like the expectations that existed within those homes where they couldn't be themselves because they actually like were lesbians, and so they couldn't live like authentically. Because of that, you're kind of outcasted, so you have to develop your own home because you don't have one, and you might not have one to go back to, at least where you could actually be yourself. So it was important to like sort of found your own home with your partner, or to sort of found a home in general, and with a partner that's like sort of creating a little family in and of itself in this home. And I think it becomes really important because there's just a lack of community, and like I think family in terms of genuine loving relationships that are built in authentic or that are built authentically in the lesbian community, because to exist authentically and as your authentic self, like often, right, would be have you completely socially outcasted and isolated. So you probably need to be with another lesbian in order to build a home where you could have those like authentic relationships. And here's a part from the Boots of Leather book that talks about this, and in it they're talking to a lesbian, I think a butch lesbian, just about sort of like lesbian culture during that time, and the concept of lesbians like building a home together really quickly, or they would, it says right here, girls used to look at each other, kiss, and then make a nest and start buying stuff. That's kind of like what it's talking about, like that how that was a norm, like women cohabitating or like building a home together. And then this butch lesbian, I believe it's a butch lesbian, says, when reminded that that wasn't true for one of her friends who had taken a long time to settle down, she replies, that's because she did not have to make a nest. She had a nest with her family. I didn't have anything, not a home or anything. I had to make one. Making a home was a goal of narrators in the 1950s as well. Having a nice home had always been important to me, not because I was into materialistic things, but to have a comfortable home, which it still is, was important. And I feel like that's really important because it's just another thing I think that contributes to the codependency that can occur in lesbian relationships. And so like with the stereotype of U-hauling, right? Like the idea is that you get close really fast and really intensely. And part of the reason that I think that is, or has been historically, is the lack of pacing barriers, or like barriers to pacing that like inhibited the depth of closeness, or like there was no specific determinants for what made your relationship essentially more serious or less serious. To be committed in general is about as serious as it can get, so you can get as deep as you want after that. I think that like contributed to the intensity, right? Like this really intense attachment. But the idea of like early cohabitation, which is obviously like the root of the joke, like you're getting a U-Haul moving in together. I feel like the idea that lesbians didn't have homes of their own, or not always, like I guess in this one's like saying how the friend had a family, so she didn't have to make a home of her own. But the lack of community and the lack of a family, or I guess like, yeah, like the lack of family and community and maybe even friends where you feel genuinely secure and safe to be who you are, and then also feel fulfilled and satisfied in your relationships because you get to be honest and authentic as you are, right? Like it's incredibly lonely to be around people that you can't be honest with, and also that you're aware of, if they knew who you really were, would probably outcast you or abandon you. And so when you find a person that you're attracted to, you have chemistry with in some way, honestly, maybe even not, maybe you're both just gay, like that could literally be it, and you're forcing the relationship to work anyways because of scarcity, right? Or a scarcity mindset, so you just cling to what you find immediately, even if maybe it's not compatible. But if you find someone who seems to be right, especially at a time where like it's probably really hard to find people like that because you couldn't be visibly gay, and like there's not a lot of like obviously community places to go and meet other gays. You cling, and you make a home. You try and like take advantage of that because you don't have other people who you can develop these like honest sort of familial relationships with. So I think you can cling to each other and project that want or that desire or even that need for that sense of like community and family, and just try and create that immediately within that relationship, or use that relationship as a way to fill that void because of that projection, right? Of like wanting a home and connections, and this being maybe the only person in your life that can offer you an authentic relationship that way, or authentic connection. And so it leads to just like wanting, I think, to, I don't know, like I guess it is talking about kind of like cohabitation, right? But just commit really quickly, like be central to each other's lives really quickly, like be your go-to person. Because when you're talking about building a home together, theoretically, like I think it's speaking to the idea of like somebody being your family, being the person that you go to, being the person that you go home to. That's a big deal. That's like a really deep level of commitment, I would say. And on it, like for someone to be the person you go home to and like they're your person, I think there's also a lot of sort of like relationship expectations for the other person to be there for you and you to be there for that person. And I think if you're sort of like cohabitating that early on, even if maybe you're not living together, but that idea, like they're becoming your person, like your sense of home really early on, who you're projecting a sense of home onto really early on, it makes sense that they would become everything to you. Because if you don't have other people in your life that you're even able to build a sense of like community with or a sense of feeling at home with, then this might be the only person. This might be the only person in your life that you can feel that way with. And now you're like, let's live together, like let's make a home. So now you're also like kind of maybe like attached at the hip, or you're like in a really serious committed state just by simply living together, right? Or like beginning to share a life, share things in your life, have joint things in your life. That already is developing a tether to each other that's really serious. That's developing a bond that might not have actual intimacy to match it. Like it could be proximity versus actual authentic depth of intimacy. You might just be really like close together, and because of that, like you're bonding and building tangibly a life, but that doesn't mean that it's actually backed by like depth and honest, genuine connection. I think it's one of those things where it's like a relationship can look really serious from the outside, but it doesn't mean that it's really deep or meaningful on the inside. That's what I mean when I said in the beginning, like marriage doesn't actually represent a relationship being really deep or meaningful or serious. Like people can get married in Vegas like overnight. Like it's just a marker, but that doesn't absolutely determine whether or not that relationship is actually marked by real depth or intimacy. It's like building a home together theoretically could be like a relationship landmark of marriage for straight people. But when you're moving that quickly or you're getting committed that quickly, it doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship actually has the depth to really, I guess, like support that quickness in a relationship, or that seriousness in a relationship, or that like commitment to each other in a relationship. But because you don't really have anyone else, like it doesn't surprise me that you would project that need onto someone, and maybe they're the literal only person, the sole person in your life that you can even project that need onto, because they fulfill the expectation of like being willing to witness you for all that you are in terms of like your sexuality and the needs that you have related to your sexuality. So you just move really quick and you don't want to let it go. And there's a scarcity mindset. And so you cling and you don't have anyone else. So they become your person. And maybe you're that for each other, being sort of like the sole person currently in their life that like offers that honest, authentic connection. And maybe the only person then you can confide in about like the woes of being a lesbian and being a lesbian at that time, because you can't confide in other people about it. You can't just like go out in public and like make friends and be like, oh my God, my girlfriend's like this, or like, oh, it's really difficult to be a lesbian right now because of this. Like you don't have that opportunity to connect. So like that might be your only person to share that with. And that's a really, I would think that would contribute to a bond being built that's very deep and very intense and also very real. And I don't think that timing is really relevant to that. I think like when you share really personal things with somebody like that, that is just naturally going to build a deep relationship, like whether or not you do it in 2 weeks of knowing each other or 2 years, like that depth of honesty will increase the depth of a relationship. And because like you're not dating in this like typical way that would, I think, hinder the time or the pace at which you would talk about things like that, or sort of you wouldn't have other relationships to share yourself with that would make it so that the person you're dating doesn't become the sole person you can share yourself with in entirety. They become like the only person you can share that with, and then the only person who understands you. And so you just like cling and you commit, and it's deep. I think that's like inarguably true. Like the idea of time is subjective and a relative phenomenon. Like if you're sharing things that deep, that early on, and you really are each other's like soul confidant, I guess that way, not even necessarily romantically, just like in terms of maybe platonically, the depth of a relationship is gonna grow, what would be the word, like expeditiously, very quickly, because you rely on each other. You don't have other people to rely on. And I just think it's interesting, I guess, when I was like thinking about the historical context, like what the landmarks became for lesbian relationships. And I think even the idea, like reading this now, that lesbians in like the 1950s and 40s openly talk about how building a home together was really important, and that was sort of like an ultimate thing to do together, or something they maybe rushed towards. And the stereotype today, or how long has that been a stereotype? Like when did that joke become a thing? Is that lesbians kind of cohabitate and build a home together really fast. And I think it's often assumed, like when people joke about it today, that it's not backed by intimacy. And I think that there can be truth to that. Like I just was talking about how like those landmarks, or even just like moving into a home together and buying stuff together, doesn't mean necessarily that the relationship is really emotionally deep or backed by real intimacy. But I also think because somebody might be the sole person you're confiding in, it actually might be that deep, that early on. But I feel like it's probably like a convoluted and complex situation to be in, because there's so much different kinds of depth that are being created in a relationship like that, for different reasons, because there's different things that you're connecting about, and they become like the only one you're connecting to someone, or you're connecting, the only person you're connecting with about this stuff. Like all the like issues that come with being a lesbian at that time, the lack of maybe family and familial support, the issues you might have had in your lesbian relationships at that time. And so those all contribute to the depth of a relationship. And so it becomes more than just romantic really quickly if the relationship is encapsulating all of these different kinds of depth, I guess, is kind of what I'm saying. I think it like becomes more than romantic early on, because they can become a sort of companion to you that is quickly more than romantic, I think. When you find anyone who understands you and accepts you at a time where nobody likely would, or it would be really difficult to find people like that, I think you can become each other's person very quickly. And I think romance, yes, can exist, but also just like deep companionship built through those honest connections related to actually just existing at that time, you know? And then maybe it is also like paired with romance and sexual chemistry or romantic chemistry, and then that only contributes to the depth, like the depth of your relationship, the intensity of it. Because when you're attracted to somebody in whatever way that you're attracted to them, obviously it makes you like even more attached to them, and it can like fuck with your head, because it's just like you can be overwhelmed with feelings about someone that don't always make sense because you're like you're just attracted to them. I've talked about how like in the past, like I've been with girls where I'm so attracted to them, like I can't think straight, or like I like them so much that sometimes like it's hard to think straight, or maybe it's more so attraction that made it like hard to think straight. And so like just the relationship got really intense really fast because I couldn't think straight. And so we just got close really fast, and we did all these things like really quickly and really fast. And I didn't like ever really stop to think about, I'd like to really like try and rationalize what we were doing in the relationship and like how that could be affecting the pace at which we're going, or like I don't know. I didn't really stop to think about the actual like pacing of the relationship. I was just like, I want to do everything with you and be with you all the time. I'm so attracted to you. So I wasn't thinking quickly. I wasn't thinking straight because I'm not straight. I'm gay. So I wasn't thinking straight. And the relationship just moved really fast. We did a lot of things that marked, I think, intimacy, or like marked commitment and depth and intimacy really quickly because we didn't have any like, I don't know, landmarks. Be damned. I was just like too attracted to her to like think of landmarks. Even though today, like where I am, I could have these landmarks, right? Like marriage, engagement, dating. But maybe that's a personal problem. I don't know. I was just like, wasn't thinking clearly. But also part of like what contributed to that was that she was one of the only, like the girl that I'm talking about in specifically where I like really struggled with this, where I really didn't think straight with her. She was the first person that I really was with when I had come to terms with my lesbianism, and I wasn't really out like as a lesbian. I was out and dating women, and people I went on dates with, I would tell I was a lesbian, but I hadn't come out to my family. And being a lesbian just like made it more difficult because there was no, well, maybe I'll end up with a guy, so maybe I won't say anything and I can avoid like coming out to them because what if, right? Like what if, I don't know, there's a chance that I could end up with someone that like I wouldn't have to tell them and things would be okay. You know, that idea in my head. But that wasn't going to happen. And I'd come to terms with the fact that I was a lesbian and I was dating women, and there was never going to be a, maybe I'll end up with a person that makes it so I don't have to ever confront this with my family if I want them in my life and also be gay. And so I was just like going through a lot, and she was the girl I dated while I was like really going through that, and the first girl that I had like an actual kind of like short-term relationship with. So I actually got really close to emotionally at the same time as like physically while I was struggling with that. And I think that contributed to why we got attached so fast, because I confided in her and she confided in me about how it was with her family then. And so we built a bond based around like the very specific experience of having a non-supportive family related to your sexuality. And I was really in the throes of it because I hadn't come out, but she had come out to her family, and like they were just about it. But we bonded over that really quickly because we told each other about that quickly. And there was just like an instant understanding that's really relieving. And when you don't have other people in your life that offer that actual I see you level of understanding, it's easy for them to in many ways become like a go-to person and for the relationship to feel very deep early on. But that doesn't speak to romantic compatibility, right? Or like lifelong romantic compatibility. That could speak to like platonic compatibility, but that doesn't determine necessarily romantic compatibility, I guess, sharing those kinds of things. But it can feel like our relationship was just really deep and like meaningful and compatible early on, I guess, when in reality, like we weren't actually romantically compatible. Like we just weren't. We could have been good friends, but I think we got caught up and swept up in the idea that we have like such a deep connection and we're attracted to each other because we became kind of, I hate this word, but like a a confidant, like one of the sole people in each of our lives that understood that part of us. And then the part of us that the other understood, like we were also embracing together. And that was like a whole other like intensity of intimacy and attachment. But we weren't romantically compatible. Like we just weren't. And then we were together longer. It wasn't even a long relationship. Like it was a situationship. And we just like objectively weren't. Like the things that we wanted in a relationship weren't aligned, not in like any crazy way, just like we weren't aligned on the things that we wanted long term. What our relationship expectations were and like standards within a relationship were different. Neither, I think, right or wrong. Like they were just different. Where we were going to go in our lives was going to be different. She was going to move within a certain number of years for sure, and I could not say that I would do that. And so we just weren't compatible, but that didn't stop us from being so swept up and so invested in each other and so theoretically serious and attached and really intense with each other, with like a really intense connection because of the attraction paired with the companionship of being each other's like sort of sole person to go to that would understand that part of themselves that is gay and like able to have these relationships, especially when like we had neither of us really had that sense of home. So like talking about how home is a really big deal in these things, or like in this history, how like building a home, I can understand. Like obviously we weren't like moving in together, but the concept of like somebody becoming like a home base for you, you're seeking that, I think, sometimes without even realizing it when you don't have one. And I think it's easy to project onto the person that is in front of you and understands you. So it's like, wow, the thing about myself that prevents me from feeling like I have a home with my actual like home, they understand. So I can like project and we can build a home base together, I guess, or a homely, familial almost sense of a relationship together, that comfort and care for each other, I guess is the way to put it, or the expectation that you'll be there for each other. And then like we were attracted to each other, so it just expedited everything. And there was really no considerations when it came to pacing to like set the pacing. I don't know. Like I think in gay relationships already, like our scripts are just different, like romantic scripts, because we just don't see gay relationships modeled for us often traditionally. So the scripts that we have related to our relationship dynamics and timing, even today in like a country like where I am, where I'm lucky enough to have been in like visibly gay relationships, I still didn't really like adhere to the pacing of a heteronormative traditional romance script. And while I could understand the traditional scripts that are applied to like heterosexual relationships, like the steps that you follow almost like contractually when you start dating, because I saw them modeled in movies and in front of me and around me, and I guess I could have been like, yeah, this just applies to relationship in general, and I'm sure that did affect me, but at the same time, it's just inherently different because you already don't see yourself modeled in those scripts, you don't see yourself represented in those scripts, and then you have two people who often, like in my experience, like two people who experienced a very similar socialization that made us quite passive. And so like you're already rewriting the script to try and figure out a dynamic that moves the relationship forward and like passes a platonic barrier as two people who were socialized not to pass a platonic barrier with each other, and also to be reactors rather than initiators. So you're trying to rewrite a script where we're like, damn, we got to learn to initiate and like break the platonic barrier. And we didn't have a script for that. And it's like the antithesis in a lot of ways to the script that we had modeled for us. So you're already rewriting your script, I guess. And relationships are not inherently scripted. Every relationship you're in will develop as it develops its own script, you know? But I guess it's just the concept of going into a relationship and having a natural sense of pacing because of like a script, you know, and specific landmarks. I guess the landmarks could apply to me now, but maybe that's like a personal thing. I don't know. I definitely U-hauled. Never U-hauled in like a 2 weeks we're moving in together, but just like really intense, really fast. Like just too much, too quick, too much, too quick. I like went out with a girl once, and like we'd been seeing each other for like 2 weeks, and we booked a trip together that would have been like 2 months out, like a full-on trip. Like we booked the place. Like we booked the place we would have stayed at, like all of this stuff. And I remember thinking like, yeah, this is like not a good idea. And we stopped seeing each other. Like it ended after like 2 weeks, and we had booked a whole trip together. Like that is in my book, that is the U-hauling. Like, yes, we didn't get a U-haul, move in together, but what were we doing? Like, hey, like we don't even know each other well enough to know that we'll get along in 2 weeks from now. And we didn't. Well, we didn't like not get along, but it ended. I don't know. It's definitely something I struggled with for probably a variety of reasons, but to speak of the social contributors. Also, another book that I was reading that like relates to this and like doesn't is Female Husbands, A Trans History by Jen Manion, I think that's how you say it. And in this book, it's talking about the history of female husbands. And in it, something I like that the author does is uses gender neutral pronouns, because we don't know the identities or how somebody would have identified who was like identified, I guess, as a female husband during that time. We don't know. We don't know if they would have identified with being maybe transgender, transmasc, maybe just a lesbian. Like there's a lot of overlap in history about those things, right? And anyways, the book is really good. I really like the book. But there's a part of it where it's talking about the relationship, the female husband relationship of, I don't know if I should use gender neutral pronouns, but in this relationship, it was he, him pronouns. So I'm going to say he, him, with James Howe and Mary Howe. And this was a same-sex relationship. And the book talks about their relationship and like the history of their relationship and all these different things. But it talks about how they were really private people, and how they were really like not social people, despite like being really big on giving back to the community. Like that was like a thing about particularly James Howe. He was really involved in the community and giving back, but not social, and so not really actually socially involved in the community. This is what it says about it. They chose privacy over domestic help and intimate socializing for any number of reasons. The most obvious, of course, is that they did not want people to get too close to them. They sought to avoid unnecessary scrutiny of their domestic habits and belongings. After working in the public eye for long hours, James needed a place to relax and unwind in their undergarments without worry. They were frugal, driven by poor childhoods, and feared that their special marriage might be discovered someday and leave them without future means of support. And I think that really speaks to the way that you can become each other's soul person. Like the soul person who maybe not only that you're in a relationship with, right? But like that understands you and that you can confide in. And when you're in a relationship, a same-sex relationship during a time where like you couldn't have an openly visible relationship and it's not easy to meet other people, it's also the only person like, I guess what I think of when I read this is that you can't even discuss your relationship with other people. Like, unless you happen to stumble upon other or find other lesbians, like you can't even confide in other people about your relationship. And so like you're even more codependent because you like literally have no one. The only person you could confide in about your relationship and your like actual relationship issues maybe itself or like is that other person. It's the only person that you can even confide in. There's no one else. So like that's incredibly isolating as both an individual and a couple. You become like literally each other's only person. And another part of the book, like when talking about the wife, Mary Howe, and this is just kind of talking about how after the wife died, Mary Howe, James Howe gave like all the property or something to her family, which like didn't really make any sense. So like it's the idea that maybe they were blackmailing him like about his sex assigned at birth. I don't know, but this is the point I wanted to talk about. It says, why would Mary out her beloved to someone knowing the harm they could cause James? Maybe it's not fair to judge Mary for wanting to share the truth about her life and relationship, especially on her deathbed. Because the idea is like, did she tell her family and they used it to blackmail him? Did she do it on purpose so they could blackmail him? Or did she just want a friend? Or did she just want someone she could talk to about her relationship, positively or negatively? Did she just want a sense of connection other than her partner, you know? And I feel like it again speaks to the way that you can become each other's soul person, especially at a time historically when you didn't even really have an opportunity to meet other persons who could become one of your people to even discuss your relationship with. And like when you love someone, it's nice to be able to talk about them. And your relationship itself, it's nice to be able to discuss with other people, to work through issues, to like just confide in people in general about what's going on in it. And so she didn't get that opportunity, and maybe on her deathbed, maybe it was malicious, but also what if she just wanted to talk about the way that she loved someone so special and this is what their relationship was like and why it was so special and they understood each other in a really special way. Maybe that was it, right? And like maybe that's all it was, and it was used then against her husband after. But it's just the concept of like going your whole life having no one to confide in about this part of yourself that allows you to be in a relationship like that, and then also about your relationship that you love, you know? So again, like a recipe for codependence and isolation together. Another recipe for codependence, I would say. Something else that's just like kind of a side note, like the concept of you can't build community, lesbians couldn't build community. Like the gay community doesn't have this U-hauling stereotype. And something that I wonder might have contributed to that is the way that gay men had the ability to develop subcultures and like places to meet. Historically, it seems earlier on than lesbians, and then lesbians seem to try and mimic it. So like In this book, okay, in this other book I was reading, it's called The Desired Past. It's also about like lesbian history and like same-sex relationship history, but it mentions how here's what it says. It says, by the early 18th century, when European settler colonies were well established in America, cities such as London, Paris, and Amsterdam sheltered subcultures of effeminate men who frequented taverns, parks, and public latrines, sought out male sexual partners, shared a style of dress and behavior, and could identify each other and be recognized by others outside the subculture. And then it talks about how at the time, like, it was visible enough or like public or well known enough where these sort of subcultures took place that the English societies of Reformation of manners knew where to find and like entrap these, I don't know if you would say gay men, but the people with partaking in this subculture, I guess. But the idea, I suppose, is that gay men were able to, I mean, for so many reasons, right? Like, we could go into deconstruct why, like, socially and politically. I don't even feel like it's pretty obvious. But men in general, gay men were able to develop these subcultures and places to convene and meet, even though it was supposed to be hidden and was hidden, because they could have social lives, right? Like, they were able to go out and commune and develop relationships because they could go out and do things, right? Like, they weren't hindered completely that way socially. So they were able to develop subcultures earlier on, and I think thus develop relationships in community. And again, like, having community and friends and other people to go to in your life that understand especially that part of you that really affects you in a world that like is totally against you because of that part of you, your homosexuality. I think it can help prevent a romantic partner from becoming your sole person for everything, and therefore hopefully or theoretically lessen the likelihood of codependence. That's not the only time, like, and then it's way later, like in the 20th century, that lesbians started to be able to kind of mimic these meeting places, and that subcultures for lesbians really began to develop. And like, I think the lesbian subculture is based on the history I've read, like really started to become something around like the 1920s. And in the book Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers, it talks about how the lesbian culture tried to like mimic these places like of meeting. But like in this book, it's talking about sex in relation to how they tried to like mimic places for lesbians to like pursue sexual relationships or encourage sexual relationships. But I still think, again, it's still a sense of like community and a place to convene and meet and develop relationships, whatever that is, right? Like, you're just not completely isolated, and your partner isn't the only person then that you're with or even have the opportunity to develop any kind of relationship with. You have more opportunity and like thus less scarcity, and so thus less clinging, I think, immediately. But it's talking about how gay men had these bathhouses where people would go and like just have a lot of gay sex, and lesbian like sexual radical feminists during like the 1950s wanted, or 1980s, whatever, wanted to mimic that. And so they started to like try and develop bathhouses, like the equivalent, and it didn't really work. Like they started to develop some of them. They had some of them, and they'd have like a bar or whatever, like host a lesbian night where lesbians could come and like do the bathhouse stuff that gay men had been doing for a long time. But in the book, it's talking about only like 8 or 10 lesbians would show up, and they wouldn't even end up actually like being sexual. They would just sit and talk the whole time, which there's a lot to be said about that. Like, the sex part aside, but just more so the opportunity for a place for lesbians to meet, you know? It's just like an increased opportunity to meet other lesbians and go somewhere where like, you know, you'll be meeting other lesbians and you can be honest about who you are and develop like an authentic relationship or connection or friendship, right? Like off the bat. So I think that increases like the likelihood of developing overall relationship and connections, which can, by having like a life and having other relationships, help prevent codependency. Maybe increase the likelihood of interdependence versus codependence. But I don't know. I think there's so many contributors to why like U-hauling and the idea of fast commitment. Oh, there's one more part. Talking about sex. This video is going to be so long. Talking about sex and like the intensity of like commitment and intimacy. Like in the beginning, how I talked about how there's no like pacing and relationship barriers. Like so depth of relationships aren't sort of marked or even like naturally paced because of certain scripts, and then like the certain actions you can do that could increase the depth of your relationship. In a couple of these books, it talks about how lesbians had casual sex. Like lesbians could have casual sex, and actually a lot of lesbians had casual sex. I would go in and pull the quotes, but like I know that I've had way too many. But like lesbians essentially had a lot of casual sex, and they had the opportunity for casual sex because they weren't held to the relationship expectations within straight relationships. I also think part of it is that like their relationships weren't public. So like their social capital, or like like their social capital and social worth and like social reputation isn't gonna be affected by like what's happening in the bedroom for them or what's not happening, because people aren't witnessing their relationship and then demanding propriety, so it doesn't have to be like proper, appropriate, or following a timeline. So you can kind of do whatever. Like it's more open-ended. The relationship can have whatever level of intimacy at any given point in time. And it is talking about how a lot of lesbians have casual sex, and I think again that's just like one of the things that isn't paced like in a straight relationship during that time. A traditional pacing where like sex is a big deal, you wait till marriage, and that increases a level of intimacy if like you're having a sexual relationship. And lesbians didn't have that barrier, so they were having casual sex, and I think therefore increasing a specific level of depth and connection and intimacy in their relationships that can contribute to the intensity of it. Should they have a sexual relationship, right? Having a sexual relationship can, I think for sure, contribute to the intensity of attachment to each other. It also mentions at one point how it could be like sort of in compensation for the fact that they were going against societal standards and having casual sex, and like trying to reconcile that with the part of themselves that feel obligated to follow social standards and expectations. They then committed to sort of make it okay. I think subconsciously that's something that it references, and I feel like that's probably true too, because we're still, even if we're still, I wasn't there, you still are affected by your socialization, and you're still affected by the world, I think, around you that encourages you to, or like expects you to adhere to those like socialized standards and expectations, romantic standards and expectations, and pacing in relationships. And so I could see that coming through, even if you're having a relationship that is against the norm and you don't have to conform and you're not conforming, but still the part of you that's like, I feel bad, I feel guilty, I feel like a lot of shame after doing something like that, because I know based on my socialization and these expectations, I've been wired to believe it's wrong. And so what's one way you can help reconcile that or make it okay? It's like making it a committed relationship and a commitment at that point. Like the point is like, you don't have a landmark of marriage, so your landmark of seriousness is commitment. That could be the equivalent of marriage in a lesbian relationship. And it's like, that can make having sex, what's the word? Justifiable, I guess. I don't know. I wasn't there. But I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting to talk about all of the different history that I think contributed to eventually U-hauling becoming the joke, becoming the stereotype, and not being entirely wrong. I just don't like when people who aren't lesbians joke about it. Like, I don't find it funny. It bothers me. And maybe I'm being sensitive, arguably, but it really bothers me because it's a symptom of, I think, discrimination and oppression regarding our relationships. And it just makes me, I don't know. I just think trivializing it by making it a joke erases really significant factors related to lesbian history and the ability for us to even develop relationships, let alone how we can develop them, especially in regards to relationship standards that are the norm because of heteronormativity. So I don't know. I don't like it, but teach their own, I guess, if they want to joke about it. But I thought I would talk about it. I thought it was interesting. I hope this was interesting to listen to. I know this is way too long. I had to change my camera battery like 10 minutes ago, so I know this is way too long. Well, I hope it was interesting to listen to, the history behind it. And I also want to make a video about the history of homoerotic friendships because there's so much history to that, like actual genuine history to homoerotic friendships, or historically called romantic friendships. Like there was literally a term for it, and at one point encouraged and completely normalized. So I want to make a video on like the history of homoerotic friendships, but I thought I would talk about this because I've been doing a lot of reading and it's all stuck in my head, so I wanted to dump it out, purge the information, I suppose, so I can think about other things. And I guess that's it. If you have any thoughts on this related to U-hauling in your personal life, or like that you've witnessed around you or observed in lesbians around you or lesbian relationships, or just like culturally or anything historically that you feel like contributes to the concept of U-hauling, psychologically, sociologically, in whatever way, I would love to hear it. I think it's a really fascinating topic when actually discussed in depth, you know, and with a respect to, I think, the particular issues that lesbians face. So if you have any thoughts, I would love to hear them. I think it's super interesting. And if there's anything you want to talk about in general related to lesbian relationships or your experience in dating, the impact of maybe going too fast or too slow, or getting really intensely connected to somebody too fast, or whatever it is, I would love to hear it. Oh my God, my camera is saying that it's, I think, gonna die again. Oh, well, okay. I would love to hear it. If you feel comfortable sharing it down below, I would love to hear it. I know others would as well. And if not, my email will be in the description and you can send it to me directly. If you have anything you want to talk about in general, I can publish it on the website. There's submissions over there. If you want to read them, they'll be linked below. If there's any topic or anything that you'd ever want to talk about, also feel free to comment it or message me. I would love to have whatever conversations are on your mind or you think would be interesting to have or you want to have. So please always feel free to ask or to bring up a topic. And I know I have some requests if you've ever requested one that I haven't gotten to, but I will get to them. And yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on anything, this or anything else. It's not only welcome, but wanted. And yeah, okay, I think I'll end it here. And I also have a Patreon. The topics over there are more mature, things that I just don't feel like are super YouTube appropriate. There's 2 free videos if you want to see what they're like. Most of them are often related to like sex and things like that, like themes of sex. The most recent one was about like learning how to enjoy or learning to enjoy sex again after trauma. If you're interested in that, those will be linked below. And okay, I think that's it. Thank you for watching. Please feel free to share your thoughts if you have any. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Okay, bye.